Welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Ed Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hey.
Hello.
Hey, guys. Today we are discussing the last book in our contemporary Chinese sci-fi series, The Fat Years by Koonchung. If you're a first-time listener, you can join our book club discussion on Reddit at Canonical Pod, which you can reach by clicking on the link in the episode description. You can also find on Reddit our previous discussions for the series, where we read Vagabonds by Hao Jingfang and The Three-Body Problem by Liu Cixin. You can also find us on social media at Canonical Pod, and if you want to support us in your local bookstore, you can use our bookshop.org link, which you can find in our episode description as well. In this episode, we'll be talking spoilers, so if you don't want the ending spoiled for you, check out our review, which was published last week. This is the last book in the series. Next week, we will be wrapping up the series with a discussion of all three books. So join us for that one as well. So I want to talk about the main question in this book, which Chen presents as what he calls 90% freedom. The idea that the government allows free discussion of all permitted topics. And I guess I might have free in air quotes here because I don't know if it's actual free discussion of all permitted topics, but no discussion of any banned topics. So why is it important then for citizens to be able to study or discuss controversial or uncomfortable topics?
Just to be clear here, do you mean to discuss 100% of that remaining 10%?
I don't even think it matters if it's 100% of the remaining 10%. I think just the fact of bringing it up, because that's what's being banned. You can't even bring up Tiananmen Square. So even if it's not fully discussing Tiananmen Square, why is it important for people to just even talk about it? It doesn't have to be 100% of what happened, but to even talk about it. And to talk about it truthfully, I guess, is the caveat, because to talk about it untruthfully doesn't really matter in this context.
I don't get why there should be banned topics at all.
So 100% freedom of speech?
I feel like anything should be able to be discussed, and truth does matter as well.
I'm not sure. I think the idea of discussing a topic is important in terms of getting closure on some sort of sensitive or contentious issue. You can get closure by talking about things openly, but you can also get closure just by forgetting things. And I think for certain ideologies, the easier or more expedient thing to do is to just force people to forget things by not talking about it ever.
But then it becomes like what we're seeing with China, both in the world of the Fat Years and Three-Body Problem. Just in reality in general, where they've never moved past certain things. They've never moved past the effects of the Cultural Revolution, even though they are an advanced society now. But the effects still linger, and they certainly linger from Tiananmen. And people still remember. Maybe after the older generation dies, maybe it won't be an issue. Like I think we talked about, maybe that's something they're hoping that the younger generation, because they didn't live through it, won't know it.
Well, here I want to kind of play devil's advocate. I'm never going to reveal my true position. I just want to keep things ambiguous. I think that there may be something said for censorship of certain topics, just in terms of mitigating the lingering effects of the past. Talking about the past would be to some people a way of keeping the wounds of the past open, and ignoring them to some minds might be a way of allowing these wounds to heal. I think that we might say that, well, we're not in any society perfectly healed over the wounds of the past in China or the US or any country that had any sort of terrible historical event. We might be in the process of it in some places. And I think Chinese people might say that in China, if people don't know or don't talk about these things, that's their process of moving on. Again, devil's advocate here. I'm not saying this is necessarily my point of view, but it is a point of view.
It seems to me if you pile enough skeletons under the rug, there's going to be a pretty large bump under that rug that gets harder and harder to not talk about.
Well, I guess you could walk around the bump. You paint over the bump, you make it look nice, and they just kind of walk around it.
Is that because your closet is already full of skeletons, Sam?
Mm-hmm. It's overflowing. You got to put it somewhere. And
okay.
Yeah, the rug is as good a place as any.
So, Sam, you're saying people should be able to talk about anything, but I think that's an ideal, especially in Western democracies. The ideal is that you have 100% freedom of speech. But in practicality, I don't think you can have 100% freedom of speech.
Right. We're not there either.
Well, no one's there. I mean, I think it is actually impossible to have 100% freedom of speech.
Earlier, you mentioned with truthfulness. And I think that's a big key because we can have 100% free speech, but what I hope we're talking about is 100% free speech in truth.
Yeah, but how do we get there?
Yeah, I guess then how do you define truth? That seems to be something we're constantly struggling, not just in this century, but in all of time, what truth really is.
If you're saying something is untrue, then you are in effect censoring that speaker because you're saying it's untrue and therefore shouldn't be spoken. And I'm not saying that that person should not be censored, especially if they say something damaging like Holocaust denial, let's say. But my position is that I don't think it's possible to have this 100% freedom of speech because I think it is actually harmful to society to have 100% freedom of speech.
Give me an example of something that should be censored at the state level.
What about national security secrets?
Yeah, I guess so. Those aren't public knowledge anyway.
Well, the issue, I think, in China is that, in this context at least, very often speech is suppressed for harming the national interest, which is a very similar claim. But I think the issue is that it's very, very loosely defined in this context. Anything could really harm the national interest, so anything could be suppressed. I think that there are legitimate claims for suppressing speech, but the actual implementation of that suppression is so powerful that I don't know who could be given it without scaring everybody.
And another example, Sam, is hate speech. I think that if, for example, a state were to punish anyone who uses the N-word, let's say someone uses the N-word and commits violence, and they label it as a hate crime, which comes with a much longer prison sentence or a much harsher punishment. You could argue that this is a form of censorship, that because of what this person said, the state is punishing them for it. If this person had not said that word, then the punishment wouldn't be as harsh. And I'm not saying that it shouldn't happen, but I'm saying that this is a form of censorship. You are telling people you cannot say this. You cannot express hateful speech. And you could argue that this is in society's best interest, that people shouldn't say certain words that cause emotional harm to others. You might also say that this is all bullshit and that people should be able to say any form of hateful speech they want. I think this is something that is being discussed in the US at least, though I think it's perhaps a bigger issue in Germany with Holocaust denial and white nationalism.
So I agree with you. I don't feel that those are the topics that are being discussed in the fat years.
Well, Sam, let me get the devil's advocate back into the room. So we were talking before
Where
about...
did he go?
He was under the rug.
He was in hiding for a while. He was in the closet with the skeletons. You were talking about, you need to have some openness. You can't just hide things under the rug. Some people might say, and here I'm recalling the series that we did on race in America, that talking about things and being open about things is not really a problem-solving solution. If we look at our own experience as Americans, we are very open about talking about race in America, not completely open, but more open than other places. but it doesn't seem to have solved the problem. Now, I agree that it might be better than it was, but can we say that just talking about things is an effective way of actually solving big social problems like racism? I would say that the example of America shows no, it's not. Doing things is much more necessary than talking.
Of course, but how do you get about doing things without talking about them first?
Mimes have shown us the way for years.
And they're universally disdained.
I tip every mime I see.
Your hat or money?
Both.
Well, don't you think that in cases of social upheaval, sometimes talking about things can actually make the unrest worse?
Well, that would be China's position, wouldn't it? The Chinese government, anyway. And once again, you're taking the devil's advocate position here. But, if I were to argue against this advocate, I'd say that social unrest isn't necessarily negative, even though in China, it often is portrayed as negative. This has a long history in Chinese thought, this idea of chaos and social unrest versus harmony and order.
In terms of anything, not just social unrest, but in terms of people living happy, self-determined lives, do you think talking about things will always promote that goal?
No, not necessarily.
I mentioned earlier that 100% freedom of speech, that is, being free to say anything, is impossible. And I think what makes it impossible is it only really works if you have a certain kind of populace, that is, people who are not bad actors, people who are critical thinkers, people who are willing to listen. Like, you need to have a certain kind of speaker and audience for 100% freedom of speech to be pro-social. Without that, then speech can always harm society in some way. And so there are limitations around speech to limit that harm. And obviously, you can't control and make every single person into this kind of ideal citizen. So that's why this 100% freedom of speech doesn't work for me. But the problem of 90% freedom of speech is that obviously doesn't work either, because in the context of China specifically, you have a state using this idea that it is protecting society in order to paper over or bury the skeletons, as we mentioned before, the sins of the government. And I think we'll all say that this is wrong, because if we believe in individuals determining the direction of their lives and individuals having some say in government, then this is anathema to that idea. In order for people living in a state that listens to them to have their wishes fulfilled, they have to be able to hold the state accountable. And for the state to paper over any kind of misdeed means that it absolves itself of accountability. It can just decide that it does not need to be accountable. For me, that is the issue of this idea of 90% freedom. And I think the book doesn't defend that idea. It just presents both sides of the idea through He and through Lao Chen.
I think, again, not necessarily me speaking here, but somebody might say that the value of a stable, reliable state is a value in and of itself, and you may find that it's greater than the value of that state being accountable. Somebody might say that an unaccountable state, built again on these theoretical good actors that you're talking about, people who try to make morally right decisions, is better than the value of being able to speak openly in ways that might undermine the stability of that state.
But the problem with that is that the state then gets to define all the terms. The state gets to define what is acceptable and what is not, and doesn't have to answer to anyone, especially its own people.
Yeah, I do agree with you. So the caveat in my previous statement is we're assuming that the state is built out of actors who are morally good people. people trying in good faith to make the right choices.
Let's bring it back to the fat years with He Dongsheng. Is he a good actor?
I think he thinks he is. I think he's trying to do what he thinks is right for China. And I think that participating in party activities is the way that he sees to advance the interests of his country and his people. He might not be correct, but that's at least what he thinks.
We have a very small slice of the populace presented by, how many is it? 3, 4 people in the room who hear He's story. And they all react with shock and disdain. It's hard for me to believe that if the rest of the country were to be given all of the facts in front of them, that all of them would then say, yeah, that's fine.
What's kind of interesting is the bargain that's made, that in order to know the truth, they agree that all of their lives are on the line. And I wonder if we can extrapolate that to China, because they are stand-ins, that the government is making some kind of bargain with its people, that if you do know the whole truth and you, I suppose, reject it in some way, that your own lives are in peril, but so is the government. So everyone's lives are in peril. And it seems like this agreement to protect each other can be extended to society at large.
It seems like the government gets the better end of that deal, because I don't think they're really in that much danger. But I suppose you could say, instead of the government, you could say a stable state.
Well, a stable state that advances the interests of its citizens, because in the end, even with all of China's ills, it is actively advancing the interest of its citizens. The problem is it advances the interests of a select few citizens way more, i.e. those at the top or the people who are well connected to the government. Their interests are advanced much further. And that's expressed in the novel as well. I see that in the drugging of everybody, because the question, and this is, once again, not the question I presented originally, but this question of whether it is ethically or ultimately good that everyone gets this happy buzz. Because you could say, well, everyone's happy. Isn't that a good thing? Even if they are drugged without their consent, they are ultimately still happy.
Well, and He doesn't want to drink that water either. He's given a choice, and he rejects it until he has to drink it.
I think to answer your question, James, it is good from a very realistic point of view, because you're talking about whether or not happiness is good. In the broadest sense, whether or not happiness is good, of course it's good. But when you interrogate the means to achieve that happiness, if you put any pressure at all on it, it's very clear that it's not good, because they have to use deceit and they have to do things that people as individuals wouldn't choose to do for themselves. So at that level of analysis, it becomes clearly wrong. But in terms of real people making real actions rather than abstract people abstracted from any particular circumstances, it is working. And I think that for a modern, technocratic, pragmatic China, working is enough. That's a viable solution for their situation.
With everything that we've discussed here, this idea of 90% freedom, this idea of doping one's own citizens to promote happiness, do you think that this book is in fact critical of China? Because I still think it is, even though by the end it seems to be a defense of China. Or I should say the Chinese government and its authoritarian actions.
I think it's still critical.
I don't think it's a diatribe. I see it as an expose. It's anti-government in the sense that it's showing you things that the government would prefer for you not to see, but those things that you're allowed to see are not necessarily damning, because they show a government doing things that ultimately are in the interests of its citizens. So in that sense, it is anti-government, but not necessarily critical of government. So we've been talking quite a lot about the end of the book where He Dongsheng is giving quite a long lecture or monologue that dominates the end of the novel. To my mind, it's almost not a novel any longer. It's more of a political essay. And yeah, as I mentioned just a second ago, Chinese readers might see it as an expose, and Western readers might see it as enlightenment. They may see something that they'd never even thought before. But can any of us see it really as a novel? Is it really narrative fiction? Is it part of a holistic whole with the rest of this novel or any other kind of novel that you've seen before?
No, it definitely felt out of place. It's quite a bit of information drop, more so than we've seen elsewhere, especially in terms of percentage. We get a lot of information drop in both the other books in this series. Compared percentage-wise, this is a huge chunk that is thrown at us. While some of it is made up, a lot of it is fairly accurate to what is actually happening in China or what has happened.
I tried very hard to forget most of what I've learned about 19th century fiction because of how dull it is, or dull to my tastes anyway. Bland, hard to get through, really boring. But, and I referenced this last episode, this is something you would see in novels from the 18th and 19th century. You would see an intellectual just lecturing you.
So then, if that's your position, but you also believe that these novels are quite boring and uninteresting, would you say that this portion of the novel makes it better or worse?
Well, I'm certainly not defending it. Your question is, can any of us see it as a novel? And for me, yeah, it feels like a very old-fashioned mishmash from a period where people haven't really figured out what a novel is. But they know, you can have something with fictional characters and you can have ideas and let's throw them in together. And it seems that over the centuries, we've refined that into a novel form, and we've kind of developed this kind of sensibility where ideas should be presented more subtly. To my tastes, no. I mean, this is obviously undesirable. It's not what a modern reader signs up for when they want to read a novel.
Yeah, I agree with you. It violates the sense of realism that I want from a novel. Not necessarily that it should be a realistic novel, but when it's the presentation of a person physically in a room talking, it should be the presentation of a real person rather than this kind of disembodied lecture notes sort of thing that we see with He Dongsheng. During his speech, he gives some very off the cuff notes with lots of facts and figures, and it just took me out of the description of the situation. It wasn't a real scene because it was very clearly something that Koonchung pulled from his notes and put into He Dongsheng's mouth. That said, I don't think it's uninteresting to read, but as a novel, I don't think it's as good as it could be as a novel. The reason why I bring this up here is because I don't think that this is a particularly good novel. It's okay, but it's not especially good. And what I'm concerned with is the way that the world understands China through Chinese literature. I found an article online. We'll link to it, of course, in the show notes. It's by a translator, Dylan Levi King. And the article is about Chinese literature and translation. And King says each year, only about 10 novels are translated into English from Chinese. For comparison's sake, about 25 novels are translated from Japanese into English. Many of those 10 Chinese novels go unread and unnoticed. Since this novel is so bad, well, maybe not so bad, but since it's not particularly good, I'm wondering if it's taking the space of a perhaps better novel because it's a quote unquote dissident novel, because it's critical. Do you think that this foreign taste for dissident fiction from China is preventing people from understanding China through its literature?
Yes, maybe, but I don't think the purpose of literature is to necessarily facilitate cultural exchange, even though it's often touted as such. I think in this case, it's a commercial enterprise. This is what people outside of China want to read about. They want to read novels that kind of make themselves feel better about not living under a totalitarian state. So the market wants this kind of book, and they consume this kind of book. And I don't know if the market really cares about understanding what China actually is. When I say the market, I mean the people who buy books.
It becomes this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, though, right? That, yeah, this is what the market thinks Western readers want to read, but then we never necessarily get the things that are popular in China. I think that there's this kind of double-edged sword that we're only seeing things like this for the most part, these dissident types of stories, but we also might be getting shielded from bad stories. There has to be this escape velocity. The prose has to be good enough to escape China for it to be translated, or at least you would hope that that's how they get picked. But I don't know. Then you have things like Vagabonds, where it's not garbage, but it's not up to snuff with a lot of the things that get published here either.
I almost feel like we're talking about a couple of different scenarios here, because the Three Body Problem is not dissident fiction, but it's very popular. So what's being left out are quiet novels that are not commercially viable, but are well written.
I think we would probably be safe in considering the Three Body Problem to be an aberration. It's not part of the normal trends in publishing. I think in general, there aren't going to be a string of Three Body Problems in the future. And the problem is that we're guessing that this novel might have pushed a more quiet novel out of that 10th spot, but we don't even know what else is available to us. If we don't read Chinese, we won't really know what we're missing. We can only judge the entirety of Chinese fiction based on the examples that get translated for us. This not only prevents something else from taking that spot, but it also makes us imagine what those other novels could be like. Maybe we might think that they're as bad as this one, or maybe they're even worse than this one, and that's why they didn't get published. We really don't know that much about the characters of these other novels other than what people might tell us.
I see it as another filter on top of the many filters that publishing already has. And I agree with you, but at the same time, in the world of publishing, and really any kind of media, you're going to have tastemakers and filters. You'll have people who gatekeep what gets through and what doesn't. For example, we mentioned Vagabonds. Maybe it was off air how a lot of other reviewers liked it too, but it was picked up and published by a big publisher. And if you are a writer who's tasked with reviewing a book by a big publisher, there is some pressure on you to not totally bash the book, because if you're an up-and-coming writer, you don't want to piss off a publisher. I mean, there's just filters of all kinds in this world of publishing. And while this is a very extreme filter because it needs to be translated, for me, it's something that already exists, but taken to an extreme. I don't feel especially bad about it. I just think that, yes, there are probably really good works of fiction or nonfiction in Chinese that are not being translated here. Even if it is translated, maybe no one will even read it, first of all. And yeah, I mean, it's just how the publishing market is. I think we could lament it, but that's the situation that we find ourselves in because of limited time, because of the effort it takes to publish something in translation. It just has to be this way, even if it's undesirable.
It kind of surprises me, though, honestly, that, I mean, with as many people as there are in China, I have to believe that there are a lot of great works that are not being translated. And, they might not all be masterpieces, but I find it hard to believe that only 10 books should be published in English.
Well, I mean, let's consider India, where a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of Indians grow up learning English. How many Indian writers have we read? Not Jhumpa Lahiri, who immigrated to the UK and then to the US, but actual writers from India.
Yeah, maybe one or two.
I mean, they grow up learning English. They write in English. You don't even have the filter of translation. I think it's just the fact of reading books from other countries, of publishing, already having this huge filter that you just, the common average reader does not pick up this kind of book. And it's a shame, but it is what it is because of lack of time and interest.
I think, James, here you're talking about it from very pragmatic, market-oriented concerns, which are totally valid. But I would say that, this enterprise that we're doing right now is kind of the way that an aesthetic reader would push back against those market concerns and demonstrate an appetite for other types of works. And, just intellectually, somebody could make the argument from, more academic point of view that these very few lanes that are allowed for Chinese writers, either dissident fiction or exotic fiction, are a legacy of the colonial times when the imperialist West kind of dominated the world and told other countries, this is the way that your culture is going to be represented on a global scale. There is an appetite in China among government elites to, quote unquote, tell China's story and to tell it well. It's debatable what's exactly missing from China's story as it's told globally nowadays. But I do think that what's missing is a lot of the human story. We don't see people as real people, either because they're portrayed as, happy-go-lucky automatons or as political automatons, which is a different sort of brainwashing. But we never see real people in the sense that you and I are real people. We've never seen any sort of like kitchen sink realism in China, which I think is a big problem. But I think that my hesitancy to join completely with this kind of tell China's story well crowd is that the reason why they're not able to tell their own story is their own fault. The story that they've given to the world by suppressing speech is that this is a country where people are not allowed to speak openly. So one of the repercussions that I think they'll have to deal with is that people are going to see them as people in need of a dissident voice. This is the consequence of their own action.
I'd agree with that. You get that big divide between what people on the outside want, or at least what the publishing world in English thinks they want, versus the story that China wants to tell. And yeah, that is the thing that I think we're missing, is everything else in between. Everything else that is not necessarily directly political or conspicuously absent of politics.
I'll also add that we do get Mo Yan, who is a realist writer, writing about very real people. And he's quite popular outside of China. So you're right. We do get an outsized number of dissident fiction. It's outsized because dissident fiction is obviously not a popular genre in China, what with it being banned and all. So yeah, like the number we get is non-representative, but it's not that we don't get the realist fiction, it's that it's very underrepresented. We do get, one or two books every year that are from, these quiet realist writers.
I want to change gears a little bit. This book invokes Hobbes and his Leviathan several times to discuss the merits of an absolute ruling government versus what he would call a state of nature or chaos. This seems to me like an insincere argument, since the world is not binary like that. There are a lot of things in between. But it's not so much the author's perspective as it is his assumed argument for the government, for the Chinese Communist Party. But I bring this up because this is actually the second book in our series that has had references to Hobbes, either explicitly in the text, like it does here, or mentioned in discussions surrounding the text. Is this a fair assessment of China's political outlook?
I don't think that anybody is saying that China in 2021 is a Hobbesian Leviathan, but I think that it's a kind of shorthand gesture towards that government that has more state power than most. Certainly more state power than Western democracies, which is why I think that the gesture is so easy to use as a kind of shorthand.
I think it's important to note that in the context of Chinese history and political history and how people think about how governments work and the function of government in China, that you often have this cyclical nature of chaos and order. And it's changing now with more modern thought being introduced. But this idea of the role of government and how it prevents chaos is very old. And I think there's a significant contingent, maybe even a majority of Chinese people who still view the government in this way, that its role is to prevent chaos. And I don't think this is just communist brainwashing, I think it is Chinese thought that the role of government is to stave off chaos. So I think there's a reason why you see this in these books. It's because that they're tapping into this sort of unspoken understanding among Chinese people that this is what the government does.
That kind of goes to my second question a little bit, that certainly rule or even ascendancy, as what we're discussing in the Fat Years, can happen without dictatorships. We have real world examples of such things. But that confused me in the book, where the characters who have captured He Dongsheng, they struggle to come up with such examples. Maybe that's just shorthand, like Iyad was saying, or maybe that's a stand-in for how, as you're saying, James, a lot of Chinese people see how governments work and how political movements work. But it just seems, I don't know, either lazy or blissfully ignorant of other systems that happen today and were happening in 2011 when this was published. It really confused me having all of these people in the room who were mad about the current state of affairs in China and yet could not point to any alternative means.
I think the thing that you have to remember is that in the context of this novel, we're talking about a world where all of the other nations have suffered an economic collapse. So they've all kind of proven themselves to be unreliable. Mm. And in that context, I think somebody would say, yes, there are problems with China, but other people have it even worse. There is no perfect option. And we might be in a bad situation now, but we would be even worse if we were in a different nation with a different form of government. I also think in actual China, in modern day China, the information that people are given about the outside world is filtered, and the negative aspects of foreign governance are amplified and the good aspects are attenuated. They don't want people to ever think that they could have it better outside of China. They do recognize the difference, but they don't ever recognize an insurmountable difference. And that difference is never presented to them as a consequence of the system of government that they have in China. They just see it as, oh, well, yeah, America has voting, but then they have chaos after the end of the election. And America is multicultural, but then it has racial conflict. Like every quote unquote advantage of another country is always coupled with a disadvantage.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about what this novel might look like if it was published this year in 2021. Welcome back. So, The Fat Years was published 10 years ago, and China has changed quite a lot since then. Do you think a new book or an updated version of this novel would express similar anxieties?
Yeah, it would express similar anxieties, but there are new issues too. And there are things that are not discussed in the book that could have been. Disappearing people has not been discussed, and the Uyghur camps and what has been going on with those.
What I think is missing from this novel is, like you're saying, Sam, a treatment of the people who aren't represented in this novel. This novel is a very good introduction to China's urban middle class, but I think it's clear at this point that an ascendant China is very good for those people. But I think that the concerns of minorities and the people in rural areas is really much more important in terms of taking a critical look at China nowadays.
I agree with all your points. And a minor note, the most unbelievable part of this book is this Sino-Japanese alliance that was presented by He Dongsheng at the end. No way that's happening. There's just no way.
Yeah.
Politically, China has changed quite a bit because of Xi Jinping. At the time of 2011, it was not a dictatorship. It was an autocratic oligarchy, I'd say, and a lot of cronyism going on. But now you have a man in charge who is quite powerful, and I think he has more power than anyone probably going back decades. I think going back to like Deng Xiaoping. So the political landscape is quite different. I don't think this book would be very similar because of the presence of Xi.
Yeah, he amended the Constitution a few years ago to remove term limits, so he can stick around for as long as he likes.
Well, let's stop here. Thank you for listening. Next week, we will talk about all three of the books that we read for this series: The Fat Years, The Three-Body Problem, and Vagabonds. We have our reading schedule on Reddit if you are interested in seeing what we are going to read next. Our next series will be Obsession, and we'll be starting with Nabokov's Pale Fire. If you would like to talk about this book or any of the books that we previously discussed, you can find our threads on Reddit, and you can join us for those discussions. We'd love to hear your thoughts. You can also find us on social media at Canonical Pod. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.